Great, so I think we'll get started. So my name is Ross Yelsey. I'm an Assistant Director of Admissions and Marketing at Columbia Journalism School. I am really pleased to have you all come to this great conversation, our final conversation about the Master of Arts program for experienced journalists, this one about the science concentration. And I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Marguerite Holloway. Hi, Marguerite.
Hi, everybody.
And to start off, I think I'll just ask Marguerite a little bit about her own career in journalism and how she got particularly interested in the science kind of beat in journalism. If you can tell us a bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. So I should just say also at the outset that if there's anything I don't cover and there are any questions you have even after the session is over, please feel free to reach out anytime. My email is myh7@columbia.edu. So I don't have a background in science. I majored in comparative literature and creative writing. And I loved science. I loved the natural world, and I took a lot of science classes, but that was not what I was interested in covering. And after I graduated from college, I started writing for some community newspapers. I'd written a little for my college paper, and it was pretty clear that creative writing was going to be really difficult to earn a living at. So I decided to do journalism, and I came to the journalism school to do the MS program. And I was committed to writing about arts and culture, and maybe I could get into doing book reviews and things like that. Was not thinking about science at all. And then I just completely fell in love with it when I got here. I found that the stories that really galvanized me and engaged me were mostly public health stories, mostly stories about contaminants, a lot of environmental stories. And I was very lucky to have a professor who's no longer here. His name is Ken Goldstein, and he really supported that. So I was just completely surprised, completely smitten with the field. I went from sort of indirectly from the journalism school to Scientific American, where I was for many years as a writer and an editor. And then I've written for many other places. And I'm happy to talk about that later. In the last couple of years, I've mostly covered climate. And I got back to the journalism school because Ken Goldstein, my professor, was retiring, and he asked me to come back and teach a class, and I was a little terrified of doing that, but I thought, I love him, he's been wonderful to me, I'll try it, and I did it, and I completely fell in love with teaching. So I won't even tell you how long ago that was, but it was an extremely long time ago. And mostly I taught in the MS program until 2005, when I had the good fortune of getting to design the science MA, and now I teach in both programs.
Great, and for this MA science concentration, what is the purpose of it? Why did you feel, and why did the school feel like we needed to have a specific kind of training in this area of journalism in 2005?
I think because, well, there are these 4 different tracks, and I mean, politics, economics and business, arts and culture. And then if you just think about, other massive areas of our society, it's obviously science and health and environmental issues. And the idea behind the program in general is that you're trying to get journalists who have some experience to think more deeply and in a more nuanced way about these different disciplines, to really think about them historically, to understand a lot of sort of the currents and patterns in them. And in science, I think it is particularly important because science connects with absolutely everything in our lives, but I think science is still seen by many people as something that's other, as something that's intimidating, that's something that's inaccessible, and that only people with very particular training can actually understand or engage with. And I think that's completely not true. Science is a human habit of mind. I mean, curiosity and testing things and observing things is just sort of fundamental human nature. And there is nothing off-putting and intimidating about science. So I think there's so many science stories that aren't told because they're seen as maybe scary or as hard or as difficult. I also think that unfortunately, and we talk about this a lot in the program, there's a long history of science journalism that evolved really in tandem with the scientific community, in which journalists were sort of seen as the translators for scientists. And the field has really had to overcome that because we're journalists. We're outside looking at the structure and the culture and the money and the personalities and everything else about science, not just translating it. And the way science is presented in the newspaper often is like one study, one study, one study, one study, all these discoveries, and not the larger context, the history and the people and the money and the institutions and all of that. And that's very much what we focus on in the class. And the last thing I would say is that science journalism and science stories have focused a lot on researchers. They haven't focused as much on people, like in everyday life. And I think that is also critically important. So I think of this very much as like science in society journalism. Where does science intersect with everyday people? What's the politics of it? What's the culture, the art, all of that. So that's why I think this program is an incredibly important component of the incredibly important program.
Mm-hmm. Great. We'll get into more detail about the syllabus for the concentration in a moment. But before that, I think I'll just ask, the MA program for all the different concentrations is for people we consider experienced journalists. What in your mind do you look for in terms of what should people already be able to do journalistically to be able to hit the ground running in this particular seminar?
Yeah, so we're not doing basic, like we expect that people understand sort of the culture and practice of journalism. We're not talking, we might talk about journalistic ethics, but we also assume that there's some understanding of that. There's some understanding of reporting, of writing. We're not doing that basic stuff, but we are, a lot of what we do in the seminar and also in the MA is stretching you. So there are aspects sort of journalistic practice that you may not have engaged with before, but it's not the fundamental stuff. So we're assuming some experience, some background in it, and in an understanding of what it is, what the ethos of the profession is.
Mm-hmm. And do applicants need to have much of a background in science per se to be good candidates?
No, you do not need a background in science. And this is something I really want to stress, and I'd like to say it again. And if I forget to say it again, please remind me. It's having a background in science is not important to this program at all. Having a curiosity about science is important to this program. As I said at the beginning, I don't have a background in science. I came from comparative literature and English and creative writing, but I love science and I love the natural world. And our students have come, some might have like a little bit of biology or maybe a little bit of, I don't know, chemistry or something, but they don't know all of the other fields that we're looking at across the year. And most of our students don't have any background in science at all. And that gets back to what I was saying about curiosity and sort of science being a fundamental habit of mind. As long as you are willing to look carefully, think carefully, use your common sense, and ask good questions, there is nothing about science that you can't master, except I would say physics. So math, we did a section on quantum physics, and a lot of that, I don't know. I don't think everybody can intuitively get that.
Yeah. Well, cool. I've had the privilege to sit in on a couple of the seminar classes in the past, and there's so many fascinating topics and people that come in to talk to your students. Could you talk a little bit about how the syllabus is divided between the fall and spring semesters and certain subjects that students will get to encounter over the course of those 9 months?
Sure. So in the fall, we look at, there's a very strong component throughout the whole year on history of science. In the fall, it's a lot on environmental history, and then sort of like not the standard narratives of environmental history. And that is something that we've just started to introduce into the curriculum. But strong focus on history, on climate change is mostly what we spend time on in the fall. We do some chemistry, we do some physics, and physics is a way of, and ecology, and physics is a way of sort of getting into technology, because there are a couple of areas of cutting edge technology that I think students really need to understand, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, And in all of these, that's like, a very quick hit in all of these different fields. But what we're looking for as we engage with them are patterns that you can take from one field and use to think about the other fields. Like, for example, history of instruments, or what the makeup of the scientific, workforce is. We look at, the peer review process, the institutions of science, science publishing, the lack of diversity in science, what all that means about what questions are asked, and how science is produced. And then in the spring, you turn more to evolution, genetics, medicine, health, and neuroscience. Again, with a very strong through line of history, because it is just so striking how much, how many patterns about how we do science were set a very long time ago, and how that legacy is playing out in terms of issues of public health and medical research and climate.
Mm-hmm. Great. And sometimes some faculty from the university or other scientists come and talk to the class. Can you tell us about some examples of people that come and kind of share their insights with the students?
Yeah, sorry, I should say the seminar meets twice a week. One 3-hour meeting is with an expert in their field. And then the second 3-hour meeting, or some weeks it's flipped, is just us, the journalists, working on our writing, on these, talking about all these issues, on reporting patterns, things like that. And we've had historian Daniel Kevlis, who used to be at Yale, who's a very renowned historian who was involved in creating the program. He comes in a lot. This year, I asked him to do a session on the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s, because a lot of the reactions to the Scopes trial and the anti-evolutionary movement then was really fear of change, fear of technological progress, fear of losing moral authority. And that seems very relevant to what's happening today in the 2020s with a sort of pushing back on expertise and on climate change, for instance. So that's like an example of a session that might be looking at the 1920s, but has a lot of relevance for us now. We had Carl Jacobi come in and talk about environmental history. He talked about how sort of the American, what's called the American like greatest idea, which was our national parks, how destructive that idea has been, and how exporting it all over the world has led to these pushing people off of their land, and sort of like the paradox of the conservation narrative. We've had climate scientist Gisela Winkler come in and give us the basics of climate science. Gavin Schmidt, who's the head of NASA Goddard's Institute for Space Studies, come in and talk about, actually he just answered questions about anything the students throw at him. We've had chemists come in, we've had ecologist Matt Palmer come in. And sometimes, although the focus is really, actually we're having a lot more people come in this semester because the students this year have a lot of questions about things that were not directly on the syllabus, but sort of adjacent to it. So sometimes, for instance, they're very interested in energy and energy systems. So we're inviting in an economist whose area of expertise is energy, and we'll do a Q&A with her. So sometimes we add things in. We do that until it gets overwhelming, and then we stop doing that. But I was about to say something else. I can't remember what. Anyway.
Yeah, and another thing I got to do is accompany a cohort of the science concentration a couple years ago to the American Museum of Natural History to learn about dinosaurs and paleontology and things like that. What are some of the visits that the class has taken in the past as well?
Yeah, so in the past, we go to the American Museum of Natural History. We've sometimes gone fossil hunting in New Jersey behind a Home Depot in an area that's rife with poison ivy. We go to the Lamont Dougherty Earth Observatory. We've sometimes gone to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We go out sometimes to the Wildlife Conservation Society. We go out on field trips for urban ecology. Obviously, that's been constrained this year. We did, though, have a really cool virtual tour of Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where people led us through the Marine Corps sediment repository, and that worked okay. It was we got a little seasick because it was a little dizzying, but hopefully that will all be back in place. But that's one of the great things about being here. There's so many places to go visit and so many people here.
Right. And a big component of any Master of Arts students' experience at the school is doing the master's thesis, which is an ambitious piece of journalism around 8,000 words in length if in print, or some people do a multimedia kind of version if they're already skilled at doing that. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with the science students, advising them on those projects, and also maybe some examples of some recent stories people have done in the program?
Yeah, so the thesis is really an incredible experience. It's oftentimes the first time a journalist has engaged with a project that is at that scale. And 8,000 words is a lot, and sustaining a project over the whole fall, the winter, into the spring is very intense. And the thing, though, that is really, I think, very powerful about it is that not only are you learning how to go very deep in reporting a subject area, and you're also learning how to play with narrative and how to play with sort of reporting for narrative, which is a different kind of reporting sometimes. And even if you're not going to work again at the scale of 8,000 words, all of the skills that you get in terms of thinking about structure, about pacing, about momentum, about character, about tension, all of that informs whatever you're writing at whatever length or whatever you're producing. So even though it might seem a bit of an anomaly to do something that long, it really, really helps you in so many ways with your reporting and your writing and your storytelling. Students have an advisor that's assigned to them usually late September, early October. And then it's just this very intense process where sometimes you might meet in a group to talk about, to analyze stories that you think are powerful ones or good models. But a lot of it is just one-on-one. You're just meeting and going over the reporting plan, and then going over draft after draft after draft after draft. A lot of professors give interim drafts. So there's supposed to be 3, but you'll find many students are doing 5, for instance, because it's only in that rewriting that you really get close to sort of making it as close to perfect as it can get in that time. And students choose topics. Sometimes they come in with a topic, something they've been obsessed with for a very long time. One student last year came in really obsessed with a particular set of environmental contaminants, and she found a story in that. Some people are just struck by something in one of their classes and then end up having that become their thesis topic. So it takes, the inspiration comes from many different places. And I've had people, I'm not going to be too specific because some of the stories that people worked on last year, they're still trying to publish. So one obviously was about environmental contaminants. One was about ecological restoration. There was one about sort of end of life issues. There was one that was on invasive species on the island of Ibiza in Spain, and that was looking at sort of what wealth and tourism, how it intersected with invasion. And that was published in Vice, which is why I'm being clear about the particulars of that. But the theses end up, sometimes it takes a few years for people to place them actually, but they've ended up in places like The Guardian, Harper's, Kindle Singles, LA Review of Books. And sometimes they don't get published. And, you still learn an enormous amount from the process. And it's hard to place something at 8,000 words. And sometimes people will chop it up and it will become a couple of different news stories or something shorter. But it's really one of the most exciting and satisfying sort of endeavors during this year.
Great. We had someone ask a question in the chat already about wanting to know a bit more about the process of developing that idea. What is that like when in the early part of the fall semester, people are pitching, thinking through this? What's that conversation like? You know, how do they kind of pin down what they want to do?
So there's just a lot that, and I have to say that this is also a characteristic of the program. Like you'll just be in constant conversation with your professors, like constant conversation. We're just going back and forth. I mean, we're trying to figure out like somebody will have an idea, they start looking into it, then it looks like too much has already been written about that. They can't find a way to advance the story, or access is going to be a really big issue, or they're beginning to feel that they're bored with it. And if you're beginning to feel bored with it a few weeks into looking at it, you gotta just like get out of it because you're going to be engaged with this topic for many months. So it's just a lot of back and forth and trying to figure out if you have a topic, because you're looking for something that's a story, but that also reflects on something much larger that is really like operating at a couple of different scales. So you need a narrative, but you also need an argument, an insight, something that you're bringing to it. So it's challenging. It's just mostly a lot of back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And then a question about people who maybe want to do something investigative in nature for that project. Is this a concentration where you could explore topics in that lens?
Yes, so a couple of things. First of all, you may already know this just about the MA program in general, but there is an MA Essentials course that is taught in the fall that is investigative. So you're really learning at the same time that you're doing the evidence and inference class and your outside courses or outside course around the university in the fall. You do 2 outside courses in the spring. And your seminar, you're really learning investigative techniques. And a lot of people do bring those to bear on their theses. And there can be dovetailing of the work that you do for that class and sort of your preliminary thesis investigations. Also, we do a lot of sort of investigative theses in the science concentration. And you just have to prepare, you just have to start thinking about the FOIAs and the timeline for that. And occasionally, if it's sort of, if there's some particular expertise that maybe I don't have in advising a thesis, we will reach out to somebody who's an investigative journalist in that area and ask for a little guidance. And that's happened with 2 theses in the last couple of years for science, and that has worked really well. But one really great investigation about how funding is determined or reimbursements are determined for Medicare was published in Politico. That came out of sort of the investigative sensibility of one of our MA grads, MA science grads. And there's another one from a few years ago who's now a reporter at ProPublica. And so there is, if you are interested in that, you can absolutely engage with that. And we do a funding assignment in the fall semester in the science concentration where you have to track where money is coming from, either for a lab or a researcher or for a field, how that's changed over time. And I'm seeing this beautiful synergy between what they're doing in MA Essentials and the investigative course right now and this assignment. And that kind of sort of reinforcement happens a fair amount.
Great. And speaking of other kind of projects people will do in addition to the master's thesis during the 2 semesters of the MA concentration, can you talk about some of the other writing projects, reporting projects that students will embark on as part of the curriculum too?
Sure. So in the fall, in the science seminar, the first assignment is taking a journal study, a peer-reviewed study, and writing a story about it. Because even though I think this is not the best way to do science journalism, it is a staple of science journalism that you still see in a lot of publications. And whether you're going to end up doing that kind of, sort of study-based story or not, you have to know how to analyze a study. You have to know how to find them. You have to know how to think critically about them. So you have to take it apart. And that's the first assignment. And then there are a lot of rewrites. And there's a lot of editing There's a lot of rewriting. Just also want to put that out there because everything, well, anyway. And then the second assignment is this funding assignment which they have to pitch me very early in the semester because it is a very difficult thing to report. And what we just have decided in class in this last week is because we were all so distracted by the election and because of sort of all of the other work they had, I've made the first draft of that story a reporting memo. It's coming in on Friday, and then it will become a first draft. So we have to be nimble sometimes about deadlines and overload. But that's the second one. And then the third one is a history of an instrument or a technology or a process. Because again, if you don't really understand how instruments and technology shape science and the questions that are asked and how they work, and you're missing this huge area of really rich stories and rich storytelling. So they've given me their pitches for those. A lot of the stories have ended up getting published, which is really interesting. And as do a lot of the news stories and some of the funding stories. And then there's an optional fourth assignment. And I've done that because people usually have one thing that they want to really work on and get better at that they've been exposed to in the fall, but they don't necessarily always have the time. So, so I make that optional.
Great. And so we've been talking so far about all the great things you get to do in the journalism school. Oh, sorry, Marguerite.
One thing also, because so much, and because I was saying at the outset, like I got into science writing in part because I love comp lit, I love poetry, I love fiction writing. We do a lot of short descriptive exercises. Like this year, because of COVID, I gave them all these packages at the beginning of the semester and they had to take them home, and there were all these mystery packages. And then when we were on Zoom, they would open one and in it would be something that they had to describe. And we do those sort of periodically throughout the semester as a way of trying to engage our description writing about all the senses. I'm sorry, but those aren't formal assignments. Those are just icing.
Sounds great, because I think a lot of people are interested in also fine-tuning their writing skills when they're in this program, not just the subject matter, but really the ability to write long form and short as well. So that's great. And so we've been talking a lot about the classes and the experiences within the journalism school, but another key aspect of the MA program is that you get to take 3 classes during your time here outside of the school in other departments and schools at Columbia, 1 in the fall and then 2 in the spring semester. Can you talk a little bit about what some students have taken in the past and how you advise them in terms of what kind of things to choose when you have all these different options in front of you?
So yeah, it's one of the most amazing things. And I always ask for everybody's syllabus, not only so that I can share it with incoming students, but also because I'm really jealous most of the time about what people are taking around the university. And I'm sorry, my phone is making a lot of noise. I try to advise people to do a combination of things so that if they're like curious about a certain area that they really want to understand better, maybe feel intimidated by, that they should do something in that realm. If they're going to be really expert on something because of their thesis, maybe they want to take a course in that, or maybe they absolutely don't want to take a course in that because they'll know so much by the end of the thesis process. It really is sort of a lot of, again, conversation and back and forth about what is best for each student. So if someone is shying away, we have lots of people who take courses in anthropology, in sociology, in the history department, at SEPA, policy, public health, neuroscience, like all over. But if I feel like somebody is just doing things that are maybe at one scale, like maybe more familiar to them, say sociology or history, I will try to push them a little bit to engage with something more nitty gritty in the second semester so that they can get inside the science a little bit. But it varies, it really depends on the person. But again, like one of the great courses last semester or last year that almost so many people in the course took was a narrative medicine class called Death and Dying. And that was a really interesting look at policy, but also philosophy and ethics and and writing, a lot on writing. Another student took a course called Porous Bodies, which is in the anthropology department and really looks at how humans think of themselves in regard to their environment and whether there is as much of a barrier between us and the rest of the world as we seem to think there is in our anthropocentric sort of point of view. This semester, someone is taking a forest ecology course. 2 students are taking food ecology and basic environmental science. And then I know there are a bunch who are interested in taking climate change law next semester. Anyway.
Great. And we talked a little bit about what people have done with their master's theses in terms of publishing things, but also, could we talk a little bit about what career paths people have had since finishing the MA Science program? I have the pleasure of operating the MA Twitter handle, which tweets out a lot of recent work by alums of all the different concentrations, but I see a lot of great MA Science work.
Yes.
You mentioned some of the people who have come out of the program and what they're doing these days.
Yeah, so it's very varied, as you might expect. There are people who have gone on to work at like places where you'll recognize all the names, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, Vice, Forbes, somebody's at the Seattle Times now, Oregon Public Radio, I mean, all over the place. And then there's some people who are really interested in Popular Science is another. We've got a couple of people there now, Scientific American. Anyway, and then there are also people who really do freelance, and they will freelance for a lot of different places. There's some people who've gone on to write books and who are sort of want to work at that scale. I think there are 4 or 5 people, one from a few years ago who's working on a book now about climate change solutions, and have tried to find a way of doing both books and freelance, and sometimes get like a baseline income gig to be able to do the book work. And then there's some people over the years who have been working on deadline and in newsrooms for a really long time and don't want to do that anymore and want to go towards scientific institutions and sort of work in more what we would consider science communications. And that, they're not a huge number of people who have wanted to do that, but that is definitely a route that some people have taken. And they've ended up at places like Rockefeller. I'm trying to remember where else. Anyway, I can't remember. Oh, the Earth Institute for a while. There was somebody there and various other, Brown University. But that's not as common, but is also one of the routes. And, sometimes it takes a while for people to find things right after. Sometimes it happens quickly. It's very varied. And it also really, as you know, is dependent a lot on what's happening to the profession at large and what the larger currents are in society at the moment. Right now, a few students from last year are doing the postgraduate investigative fellowships at the journalism school. So that's something that has been really interesting. Like if you didn't really think about doing investigative work before, you got here, you really love it. There are these postgraduate fellowships, and the science students tend to do really, really well in those because a lot of them are they've been covering climate, or they've been looking at migration intersection with climate, with mental health issues. And so there are 2 who are doing that right now, and one who's working at Science News on a fellowship. And anyway.
Great. And I put in the chat our Twitter handle for the MA program, so you can look through there anytime and kind of see some recent stories from people from all of our different 4 concentrations. I can say I saw Shayla Love, who's an alum of the science program, has a story today in Vice about sighing, why people sigh and why maybe sighing too much can be a problem. So that's an interesting story. She always has an interesting angle on very, kind of questions you might not have asked until she kind of asked them, and you realize, wow, that's a really cool question she has. Yeah.
And I would like to mention that Shayla was originally in the arts program.
Oh.
And that she realized after sitting in the arts the first session that she didn't know that you didn't have to have a science background to be in the science section. And then she realized she maybe knew some of the discussions that were going to be happening in the arts because she felt a lot of kinship with that realm. And so she just, I opened the door after the first class, and one of the professors from the arts program was standing there with Shayla. And so she came in. That doesn't happen. That's the only time that's happened. But I just want to make the point that she felt maybe off put by science, but it was exactly the right place for her.
Great. And I think Dino Grandoni has a story too. He writes about climate for the Washington Post, and is writing about what the Biden administration might do for climate right away once they take charge. So
yes,
a lot of great work out there.
Yeah.
So great. And then I think going back to the application for people who have been watching this and are thinking they might be interested in applying, what makes for a strong application in your mind for this particular MA science concentration program? What do you look for in a candidate?
All right, just to reiterate, I do not look for background in science. I just want to make that really clear. Curiosity, like a real sense of sort of curiosity about science, about how science intersects with society, like about the natural world, about, really all of everything. But it's mostly curiosity, and it's mostly a desire to push yourself to think in different ways, a desire to be creative and to explore. So we talked about before, narrative and storytelling. We're looking for experience, as we mentioned at the outset. This is a program for experienced journalists. But what that experience consists of is not, sometimes it can be not that much experience. Sometimes it's a huge amount of experience. It just really depends on the person and sort of the argument that they're making about why they want to come here. And you can tell so much from the essays about how people think and their creativity and their curiosity. And that's really what we're really looking for.
Great. And for someone who might be watching this and feeling like maybe they don't have that journalism experience to really be ready for the MA program, in the MS program, if someone chooses to apply to that, what kind of opportunities might they have to do scientific reporting, storytelling in that program, and having the opportunity to potentially work with you in a class or on a project?
Oh, in the MS, usually in the fall, my colleague who teaches the co-professor in the science journalism MA program is Jonathan Weiner. And usually in the fall, I teach in the MA and he teaches in the MS. And he will teach some narrative writing classes and sometimes some memoir classes. And because he has such a strong focus on science and love of science, that really infuses those courses, even though science might not be in the title of those classes. But those, if that's something you're interested in, you would definitely want to work with him. And then in the spring, there are a couple of courses. There's a covering mental health course, and I teach something that is either covering climate or covering the environment. And I often try to teach it with someone who's a documentary filmmaker or who's an animator or who's a photojournalist, because I feel that we're really, first of all, I love visual stuff, but also I feel like we really need to keep exploring and pushing how we're telling climate stories and environmental stories so that they reach people in a more, engage people more. And I will say last year, I got to teach in the fall in the MS, and I taught an environmental writing class, and that was really, really fun. But I probably won't get to do that again for a while.
Great. And so we're getting some questions in the chat. Please feel welcome to put more questions in the chat for Professor Holloway. One of them is about having diverse perspectives in terms of the expertise you have in the seminar and in the curriculum. How do you kind of design the curriculum to hopefully kind of engage voices from different areas of the scientific world?
Yeah, so we're definitely trying to be very, very thoughtful about that. We talk a lot about how, I think I mentioned this at the outset, but like who are the scientists and why is there not more diversity in science? And we talk a lot about how you diversify sources in your stories and why certain fields still look the way they look, and maybe what that has meant in terms of, I think I mentioned this before, but public health is one perfect example. So we try to invite people in who are coming from different backgrounds and who present diverse points of view. And I would say that, like, for example, this year, one of our most interesting speakers was a philosopher from the University of Michigan named Kyle White, who's written a lot about traditional ecological knowledge and has written a lot about environmental justice, and who really was making a very strong argument for the need for, in particular, really different kinds of narratives around climate. And so that's, he's one example from this semester of someone who I think has really reshaped the curriculum in some ways a little bit.
Great. Yeah, that's great. And a question about, someone was asking about kind of bringing video or visual equipment to the MA program. Are there opportunities in that program to do much in a multimedia format if you have the skills or wherewithal to do that?
If you have the skills, there is, but it's very hard. There are skills courses that you can take in the fall, like a radio course, or I think radio, I'm not sure if there's still a photography one. They've been offered over the years, and sometimes people just feel like they get so overwhelmed with work that they don't necessarily are not able to follow through with those courses all the time. But if you do have a background in, say, video and video editing, you can work in those media. I'm very happy to engage and give whatever feedback I can. We've had a couple of science MAs do their thesis as a documentary. 2 years ago, one of our students did a documentary about traditional ecological knowledge in the Amazon rainforest and the loss of medicinal plants. And so she traveled there and did this beautiful documentary. As I mentioned before, with the investigative help sometimes, because I'm not a documentarian, although I have lots of opinions about storytelling and arc and narrative and characters and all that, we reached out to somebody on the faculty to sort of look at Olga's first cut and her second cut, so that she could get some feedback from somebody who's much more technically proficient and has a lot of experience, and not just opinion.
Great, and less technical question now, but more about like the student life. I'm an alum of the MA program, and I can kind of remember what it's like to be kind of with your cohort and kind of the close connections you make with people. What are your observations about what the kind of student life, the kind of the cohort kind of social experience seems to be like?
The cohort is, I mean, what happens in that room is just extraordinary. I mean, people become this family, and they stay in touch for, I mean, I just had a little reunion on Zoom with students from 2 years ago, and they're all, despite COVID, are all sort of constantly in touch. So not only are the professors very much in touch with many of our students for forever, but the cohorts themselves become these very, very tight communities. And there's also a lot of, particularly because of evidence and inference, and because of the essentials classes, the investigative and sometimes data, they get to know each other across cohorts. I would say that's been one of the things that's been very difficult this year. That's not happening as easily as it can when you're all in, getting out of class at the same time. You don't have to be 6 feet apart, and you can actually see each other's faces. But even so, I just heard in class today that there had been a little picnic in Central Park that the politics group had organized and invited everybody else. And so anyway, it seems to be, definitely the cohort is very tight in the way that it always is, despite COVID. I would say that the inter-cohort is a little weakened this year, but we'll probably be fine by the end. But yeah, no, everyone seems to get along really well and really support and help everybody. And there's a huge network of people out there. For the first year, actually, this year, I asked one of the MAs who graduated in this spring to put together a LinkedIn page just for the graduates of the MA Science program. And it's huge. And they were like, just already sort of really active and talking.
Mm-hmm. Another great thing about the MA program and the science concentration is usually the international nature of the student body too. Can you mention maybe where some people have come from in previous classes and the kind of the things they bring in their own perspectives?
Yeah, I think one of the things I love about it is that it's very international, and it's also usually very diverse in terms of age. And I like that because people bring all these different kinds of experiences. They bring a lot of different cultural background and stories from journalism and different fields of science from all over the world. We have people from India, we have New Zealand, last year Chile, Brazil, India. We've had people from Canada, Australia. I mean, basically almost everywhere. Belgium from last year, who's also from France, who's also from South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Iceland, I think. Tryggvi.
Iceland, Nigeria. Yes, really all over the place, and it's wonderful because we have very intense discussions about journalistic norms in different places, and that's really helpful because you can talk a lot about how to do things better, but you also have to keep confronting sort of what situations are and how those might change over time and how to strategize about that. Yeah.
Great. A question more about the social kind of structure of the program in terms of what the working environment is like. Is it very collaborative? Are people working pretty independently, or are there opportunities to do some joint projects and collaborate in that way?
In the seminar, you're really working independently. And because there's so much is about working on your own writing and reporting, and there's so much editing that it really wouldn't work as a collaboration. That said, we workshop everybody's work. So you read everybody else's stories, and then we critique them in class. So there's collaborative discussion and editing around the work, but no group projects. In evidence and inference, there are some group projects, and that is really nice because it brings people from, say, like the business concentration together with a science person or a politics person with an arts person. And they were just telling me in class today that they're doing an oral history assignment, and that then there will be a peer editing of the oral history assignment, and they'll be paired with someone in a different concentration. And that, I think, is terrific. But it's a lot of work, and it's very hard. Collaborations require a lot of time. Mm-hmm. Just anyway.
Yeah, and a question about, I know we have so many different topics that the seminar will address, from climate to medicine to technology to history. For students who want to come in and they really want to do all their writing around some area of science already, whether it's climate or whether it's health or whether it's tech, will they be able to just kind of do most of those assignments in that area, or will they have to kind of do things in other areas of science in those projects beyond kind of their own interests?
No, I mean, I feel like people do the best stories when they're following their bliss and they're following what they're passionate about. So for example, in class right now, there's a student who's really interested in bureaucracies. And so she's looking for stories that relate to sort of bureaucracy in some way. And she's looking across different fields. But I think that, I just encourage everybody to do what interests them. As I said before, I will try to encourage people, if I feel like they're getting too narrow, maybe in their outside courses, we'll encourage them to take on something that pushes them a little bit, that gets them to think in a different way. Because I think that is one of the wonderful things about being here on this campus, that you can take these courses in other departments and get some engagement around areas that you're not that familiar with. But no, I think people do their best work when they're like, they can look for an instrument in the field they're interested in. Like people who are obsessed with marine biology will find an instrument from marine biology, and so forth.
Great. I should mention too, for the classes in the journalism school and outside the school, there's the option to take them pass-fail. So there's a kind of a chance to explore things out of your comfort zone if you want to, and not feel maybe as obliged to keep focusing on your GPA or your grades for those as well.
Yes, highly, highly, highly recommended.
Yeah, and then kind of another big question for, since it's a short program, 9 months, and there's a lot you take in, a lot of things you produce, is there a good kind of mindset you'd recommend coming into the program if you were in the MA program to kind of take in all this information and try to make the most of it given that short period of time you're at Columbia?
I think a couple things, like just realize it starts slow, and people begin to feel like at the very beginning they think that, as I said, but like we should add in all of these extra lectures and extra sessions, and very quickly it becomes clear that it is just a lot of work, and that you just, I would think, just thinking about the long term, and just pacing yourself and being aware that it is going to feel overwhelming at times, but you'll get through it. I think that's really important. I also think people forget to step away from their work, and that a lot of people will hit roadblocks inside their thesis or working on a story because they're just so deeply into it. And I really encourage people to just stop for a while and just go to a museum, or go take a walk, or take a weekend off, or go be with their family, or just something. And I think you need to build in, I'll remind you and your other professors will remind you, but to just remember that this is not your entire life, and that you just also need to step away to be able to sort of paradoxically participate fully, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a great advice. And I think that closes our chat conversation questions. So thank you for everyone's great questions. And we look forward to talking more. As I put in the chat, we have our apply.journalism@columbia.edu address for any admissions related questions you might have. And then Professor Holloway was kind enough to put her, we put her email in there. If you have questions specifically about the science curriculum, you're welcome to get in touch with her as well. Thank you for taking the time to talk with everyone today.
My pleasure. And also, one of the things I think is really important is talking to students who've been through the program. And so I can give you people to talk to if this is really of interest to you. And then I always recommend that they then recommend some people. So you're not just getting the people like I am suggesting, and Ross can do that too. But it helps people a lot to hear from people who've been through the program.
Right. I'll mention that the application deadline for people interested in applying to the Master of Arts program for this next cycle will be January 6, 2021. So you have about 2 months to finish that application for the MA. If you're applying to the MS program, it'll be December 15th. So about a month away now for that one. And we're happy to chat about any of the questions about the application at that apply.journalism@columbia.edu address for sure. All right. Well, thank you very much. Everyone have a great afternoon or evening.
Bye.
Wherever you are. And
Thank you.
here. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.